For thousands of years, the desert sands of Egypt held on to a secret. Massive stone pyramids stood like sleeping giants, whispering stories in a language no one could read. Their builders were gone, their names forgotten, their voices silenced. But in 1799, during Napoleon Bonaparte's campaign in Egypt, a French soldier made a discovery near Rosetta, 35 miles from Alexandria, that would shake the world. He found a slab. Not gold, not jeweled, but stone, heavy, black, and carved with 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. The Rosetta Stone. And with it, we found the key to decoding a language that had been dead for over a millennium, and unlocking the legacy of one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. But to truly understand Egypt, we must go back, way back to the very beginning. Before there were pharaohs, pyramids, or hieroglyphs, there was only a river, the Nile. It didn't just give life to Egypt, it was Egypt. Long before anyone dreamed of gods or kings, the land we now call Egypt was wild, unpredictable, and empty. Then came the waters. Each year the Nile rose and fell in a divine rhythm, flooding its banks and leaving behind a gift, fertile black soil. From that soil came life. And from that life came civilization. As Herodotus once said, Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Let's trace the roots of Egypt. From scattered prehistoric settlements to the rise of a nation that would echo through time. Long before Egypt had kings, temples, or tombs, it had a river. The Nile, a force of nature that carved a path through an otherwise unforgiving land. Stretching over 4,000 miles from the highlands of East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile was not just a geographic feature, it was the spine of Egyptian civilization. Each year, without fail, the river would flood. Not in chaos, but in rhythm. These floods were not feared. They were celebrated. The waters rose in the summer and retreated in autumn, leaving behind a thick layer of black silt, rich with minerals and nutrients. This wasn't soil. It was life itself. And nowhere else in the region had anything like it. This predictable fertility transformed Egypt's narrow riverbanks into a strip of green in a sea of desert. Crops flourished here: wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. The land was so productive, in fact, that it could feed dense populations, sparking the gradual shift from small foraging bands to stable, permanent settlements. But the Nile was more than a food source. It was a natural highway. Boats crafted from papyrus reeds could carry people, goods, and ideas from the southern cataracts to the delta in the north. Trade routes emerged, communities became connected, and slowly a shared cultural identity began to form. Not overnight, but through centuries of shared reliance on the river. This intimate relationship with the Nile shaped everything, from how Egyptians understood time, to how they defined death, to how they envisioned the divine. The river flowed from south to north, but the sun rose in the east and set in the west. So east became the land of the living, and west the realm of the dead, a belief that would one day govern the layout of temples and tombs for millennia. In this fertile corridor, the seeds of civilization were sown, not by empire or conquest, but by rhythm, resilience, and reverence for the river that made it all possible. Before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before the first hieroglyph was carved into stone, there was a chapter of Egypt's history that left no written word behind. Historians call it the pre-dynastic period, a vast stretch of time that spans nearly 3,000 years, from around 6,000 to 3150 BCE. Though invisible in texts, its story is engraved in the bones of the land, in pottery fragments, burial sites, and the slow rise of complexity along the Nile. In this early age, Egypt wasn't a kingdom, it was a mosaic of cultures. Different communities, isolated by distance but united by the river, evolved independently. We know them not by what they called themselves, but by where we found them. The Fayum culture near modern-day Cairo, Merimde, further to the north, Badarian and Nakata in the south. Each left behind clues: handmade ceramics, fishing tools, remnants of homes, and the first signs of agriculture. Among them, the Fayum Marm. A culture stands out for its adaptation to the lakeside environment. Between 5000 and 4000 BCE, these people built reed huts, cultivated grains, and stored their harvest in underground pits. In their baskets and tools we see more than survival, we see intention. The emergence of settled life was not simply a response to nature. It was a choice, a transformation. Meanwhile, in Upper Egypt, the Badarian people practiced early social stratification, shown in their burial customs. Some graves had simple grave goods, others items of beauty, ivory combs, polished stone vases, decorative beads. Even in death, status mattered. This was the beginning of a concept that would soon dominate Egyptian thought. Eternity could be prepared for. By the time the Naqada cultures rose to prominence, the changes were unmistakable. Villages became towns. Trade routes expanded, reaching Nubia to the south and Canaan to the northeast. Pottery became more sophisticated, not just functional but expressive, decorated with boats, animals, and human figures. These weren't just objects. They were ideas, passed from hand to hand, community to community. The Naqada II period, around 3500 BCE, marks a quiet revolution. Burial sites grew larger and more elaborate. We begin to see elite tombs, some lined with mud brick chambers, hinting at emerging political structures. The dead were buried facing west, toward the setting sun, a practice that would echo in Egyptian religion for thousands of years. In this invisible age, Egypt learned how to settle, how to organize, how to bury its dead, and how to dream of something more permanent. It was not yet a state, but the tools, the beliefs, and the structures were falling into place. The next step would be unification. And the first kings. Every civilization eventually faces a moment when memory is no longer enough. Oral stories fade, counts are forgotten, promises vanish. At some point, words must be carved into permanence. In ancient Egypt, this moment came between 3400 and 3200 BCE, during the late stages of the Naqada III period. Out of the marks etched onto pottery and bone, a new language began to take shape. Not spoken, but written. It wasn't a language of letters or alphabets, but of symbols, each one alive with meaning, a visual bridge between the earthly and the divine. This was the birth of hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphic writing didn't emerge all at once. At first it was practical, a tool of the rising elites to label possessions, track offerings, and mark ownership. On tags attached to jars and crates, symbols recorded what was inside, who it belonged to, and where it came from. But even these early labels carried more than information. They carried identity. Some included the names of individuals, possibly rulers, surrounded by symbols of authority. These weren't just notes, they were claims to power. Much of this early writing has been found in Abydos, a sacred city in Upper Egypt, nestled at the desert's edge. Here, at a site known as el-Ka'ab, the tombs of the earliest known kings, Scorpion Forest, Ka, and Narmer, were built in deep connection to the gods and the afterlife. Abydos was not only a burial ground, it was a spiritual gateway, believed to lie on the edge of the land of the living and the land of the dead. It was at Abydos that archaeologists uncovered some of the first full royal names, written in what would later become the pharaonic cartouche. These inscriptions, carved on ivory, clay, and bone, represented an astonishing leap. Not just keeping records, but defining legacy. For the first time in Egyptian history, words could outlive their speaker. What began as administrative necessity evolved into artistic and religious expression. Over time, hieroglyphs would be carved into temple walls, painted in tombs, and etched on obelisks. They became sacred, the words of the gods, believed to carry divine power when inscribed correctly. Through writing, Egypt learned to remember. Not just taxes and temple offerings, but stories, laws, prayers, and names. Names that still survive today. Names that whisper across time. The age of myth was giving way to the age of history, and Egypt was preparing to be written into it. By the close of the 4th millennium BCE, Egypt was no longer a land of isolated farming communities. It had become a patchwork of competing chiefdoms, some large, some small, each rooted in the fertile Nile corridor, each ruled by local elites with growing ambition. Among them, 3 dominant city-states began to rise in Upper Egypt: Thinis, Naqada, and Nekhen. These were not peaceful neighbors. They were in a slow, grinding contest for control. Meanwhile, to the north, Lower Egypt, lush with marshlands and the sprawling Nile Delta, had developed its own centers of power. The cultures were distinct, in language, in customs, in burial practices, and even in the gods they revered. 2 regions. 2 crowns, 2 lands. But the tide of history was turning toward unification. Around 3150 BCE, a ruler emerged from Upper Egypt, a name that would echo through time: Narmer. He wasn't the first to dream of uniting the 2 lands, but he was the first to achieve it. not just through war, but through symbolism, strategy, and ceremony. The story of this monumental act is etched into a single carved stone, the Narmer palette. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, smiting a northern enemy. On the other, he dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, leading a victorious procession. In his hands are the tools of domination, the mace, the flail, but around him are signs of divine approval, the falcon god Horus, the papyrus bloom, the royal standard. It is not just a political conquest, it is a sacred union. Narmer's consolidation was more than military victory. It was the creation of a new identity. Kemet, the Black Land, united under a single divine ruler, the pharaoh. To reflect this unity, Narmer founded a new administrative capital, Memphis, strategically placed where Upper and Lower Egypt met, a city meant to embody balance, control, and royal order. With unification came more than symbolism. It brought a centralized government, new systems of resource collection, and a standardized religious worldview that aligned both halves of the country under a cosmic hierarchy. The pharaoh became not just a king, but the living embodiment of Ma'at, the divine principle of harmony, justice, and truth. Thus, Egypt entered its first era as a true nation-state. A single language, a single ruler, and a singular vision, stretching from the Mediterranean delta to the rocky cataracts of Nubia. The double crown, the Shent, merged the red and white crowns into one, a symbol worn by every pharaoh to come. Egypt was no longer many, it was one. This new era, beginning with Narmer and followed by kings like Hor-Aha, Jer, and Den, is known as the early dynastic period, c. 3150 to 2686 BCE. Pharaohs were more than kings, they were considered gods on earth, mediators between the people and the divine. They wore the double crown, Shent, and carried sacred symbols like the crook and flail, representing kingship and fertility. They ruled from cities like Thinis, Abydos, and Memphis, issuing laws overseeing trade and commissioning temples and tombs. The economy was rooted in agriculture, and bureaucracies began tracking grain, cattle, and labor. We even find tax records, sealings, and tomb inscriptions during this time. This era set the foundation for everything to come: pyramids, religion, and monumental art. By the end of the early dynastic period, Egypt was no longer a scattered group of tribes. It was a centralized, religiously unified, and economically advanced civilization, with a written language, a pantheon of gods, monumental architecture, and a belief in the afterlife so strong, they began building entire cities for the dead. This was not just the beginning of Egypt. It was the beginning of one of humanity's greatest stories. Before pyramids touched the skies, before kings were carved into stone, there was the Nile. Its waters gave rise to a civilization that would inspire the world for thousands of years. And while Egypt's future held triumphs and trials, gods and conquerors, wars and wonders, the legacy of its earliest days would never be forgotten. This was how it all began. If you found this journey into the origins of ancient Egypt as fascinating as we did, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you never miss a deep dive into the ancient world. Got questions or theories? Drop them in the comments. We'll see you in the next one. But until then, keep seeking the past. Because history is never just about what happened. It's about who we are.